So for only the second time, I've managed to get someone on the show that is, my other hobby, other than training and fitness and health. After Simon Miller, you're now my second, pro wrestling link guest. But for people who aren't wrestling fans or movie fans, and we'll come on to that in a bit, tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are.
I also love training like you and Simon Miller. In fact, I was just at the gym right before this. But first of all, Simon, thank you so much for having me on. Thank you for coordinating with our time zones, which I believe are 16 hours apart, which is, crazy. You're living in the future, man. You are literally living in tomorrow.
I say this to every person who has a birthday back home. I always message them, happy birthday from the future.
Yeah. Can you give me the lottery numbers? This would be amazing. Yeah. It's like Back to the Future 2 here. Old Biff. I love it. But my name's Chris Van Vliet. I thank you for pronouncing it correctly. And I've worked my entire career as a broadcaster, TV host, radio host, been super passionate about broadcasting. And as things are kind of starting to shift in terms of what broadcasting means and what the future of broadcasting might be, I started to go into YouTube and podcasting, and I'm sort of seeing that as a way to reach an even bigger audience than being on TV, which is what I've done for most of my career. So I think at the heart of this, I love talking to interesting people, and I love being able to figure out, like, how did somebody get to where they're at? You don't get to win 7 Super Bowls like Tom Brady or win several Oscars like, number of actors by accident. And I think it's important to find out what their stories are, and even more important to figure out, like, where did they stumble along the way? Like, what happened? We only see the finished product so often. So I like to dig in and find out, like, what happened along the way to make Oprah, or The Rock, or Tom Brady.
I totally agree with that. And as I said in the post I put yesterday, it's like the podcast for me was a huge passion project that I didn't get off the ground for many reasons. I was holding it off. And the thing that made this such an exciting prospect, and continues to be such an exciting prospect, is exactly that. It's finding out a little bit about, like, the people that are successful. They're no massively different to any of us. It's almost just sort of like, okay, what are the things that they've done every single day? What's the people they've met? What's the networks they've had? What's the lessons they've learned? And I find that fascinating. There's something really captivating about being in a room with somebody that's managed to achieve something. And I was interested to get you on because it's we always talk about your job almost is to listen to these guys. And like the amount of like lessons that you must have learned from speaking to people like, The Rock, Henry Cavill, RVD, all these big names and many more. There must be so many things that you sort of learned from that process. But like, before we go into your journey and where we come into that, you mentioned, changing what the future of broadcasting is. I mean, do you find that YouTube now is a much bigger platform than any of the TV work that you did previously? Is that primarily all your business now?
Yeah. And what's really interesting is I feel like most people just know me as the quote unquote wrestling guy or the quote unquote wrestling interviewer. And I'm like, that's really kind. Like, I appreciate that. And I've certainly interviewed a lot of wrestlers, but I've interviewed a lot of different people from a lot of different walks of life. But when you're passionate about wrestling and you're able to do interviews with people who are wrestlers, that was where I really started to see a lot of growth. But look, I think that broadcasting has just changed a lot. Broadcasting used to quite literally be, those two words together, broadcasting, and something, broadcasters or broadcasting networks would put something on TV. And back in the day, you turned on the TV, and if you didn't like what was on channel 3, you watched channel 4. And if you didn't like channel 4, you watched channel 5, and you channel surfed all your way through until you just decided, I guess I'll watch this thing I don't even really want to watch. That doesn't exist anymore. Like, that idea of watching something you don't want to watch doesn't exist anymore, because if you're not interested, you just click to the next video, whether that's on YouTube or click to the next show on Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, HBO Max, and so on and so on and so on. So it's quite literally gone from broadcasting, like, let's throw spaghetti at the wall and see how much of it sticks, to niche casting, like, I'm going to have a YouTube channel about trading just Dogecoin or, whatever it happens to be.
Yeah. I remember watching like another podcast channel I used to really love was London Real. And like seeing how that's had to niche down, and it's very Bitcoin centered right now. Like what do you feel has helped you stand out in a very crowded YouTube market?
I started early, which I think is a really big thing. And I kind of started by accident, if I'm being completely honest. I was working as an entertainment reporter and I had access to, incredible conversations with literally some of the best in the world. I was interviewing people like Henry Cavill or The Rock or the Hunger Games cast when that was a really big thing, or the Twilight cast when that was a really big thing. And I just started thinking to myself, like, I really enjoyed this conversation with Jennifer Lawrence, for example. It's too bad that if you weren't watching Channel 19 on this exact Wednesday at 4:17 p.m., that you'd never see it. And I just started taking the raw version of those interviews and just throwing them on my YouTube channel, just kind of as like a digital place for them to live, like a digital library. So that was 2011 when I was just kind of throwing these videos up just so that they would exist somewhere. And if you happen to be a fan of Jennifer Lawrence, you might stumble across this one day. So I think that was a really big thing early on, is just having the access that I had, and not too many other people were having these digital libraries, if you will. So that was a really big thing, I think, early on. And then as I kind of got going, a super important thing was just being consistent. And I think that the best thing about podcasting or YouTube is that anybody can do it. And the worst thing about podcasts and YouTube is that anybody can do it. And I think it's really important to, number one, ask yourself, why am I doing this? Is this just a hobby? Or am I going to try to like turn this into some sort of a business and make money off of it? And also, like, what is my plan now that I've determined this is a hobby or a business? What's my plan now? And I just started being consistent. And I think I started with like, I'm going to do 50 wrestling interviews this year, and just started setting goals for myself and chasing after those.
Yeah, I think one of the big things I said, as I was looking back yesterday, looking over this show, it's like, I couldn't believe how quickly I was up at like 38, 40, plus like interviews. And it was just, I set myself that target. It's like, I'm going to have a very least every Monday an interview on. And I very rarely repeated one, because I'm pushed by that deadline to start messaging random people. And I think that's really interesting, because if you asked me a year ago, or I didn't set myself the deadline of doing that, I wouldn't have been on this interview today, because I would have seen the people with bigger followings than me, or people that I admire. They go, they won't want to be on. So I just would have probably just not done it and chatted to my friends and then run out of people. But because I have that deadline, it's like, okay, well, I'm just going to drop a message here. And 8 out of 10 will get ignored. And I'm always a very big believer in, like, as you're building a brand, I'm sure you agree with the same thing. There must be people that jumped out and helped you out in the early part of your career when you weren't as well known as you maybe are today within the field. Like, who were some of those early interviews that sort of took you to a next level, whether it was on YouTube, whether it's when working for MTV2 or wherever?
Well, Simon, I was like so lucky to have a network of like a television network behind me. So they weren't necessarily doing an interview with me because I was Chris. They were doing an interview with me because I was the representative of the TV network that I worked for. So, I mean, that worked in my favor massively. To be able to be on an actual TV network carried a lot of weight when you were interviewing. I was like 2 years into my career and I interviewed Oprah, or like, I was covering the Toronto International Film Festival and got to interview like quite literally some of the biggest stars in the world. So I think that helped a ton in terms of like YouTube views and new YouTube notoriety. I had a ton of success interviewing the Hunger Games cast, Twilight, like those were like million view interviews in like a week. And then I knew that I was going to have access to Henry Cavill. When he got named as Superman, I had access to him for another film, and I just happened to ask him about it. And then it became like a headline, and I went, oh, I think we're on to something here. Like, maybe I can find a headline with this famous person that I'm interviewing and throw that up on my YouTube channel. Also use that clip on TV. So I think where I really saw the value in wrestling interviews was I interviewed The Miz in 2011. He was throwing out the first pitch for the Cleveland Indians, and it was like a 3-minute interview, and still on my YouTube channel if you want to check it out. And we were just kind of chatting before we officially started the interview. And I said, oh, I just saw you at WrestleMania. And he's like, oh man, he basically dropped during that chat that he was concussed and didn't remember winning or retaining the championship at WrestleMania 27. I didn't think anything of it, posted the interview, went to bed that night. I had 5 followers at the time, 5 subscribers, woke up the next day and there were 6,000 views in that video. And I went, whoa, well, that's interesting. Woke up the next day and there was 36,000 views. And I went, oh, there's something on to the idea of people embedding this video or sharing this video. And that was where I was kind of like, oh, well, just try to do this a little bit more often if possible.
I remember, I think the first time I came across you at YouTube was actually nothing to do with pro wrestling. It was the I insulted Anne Hathaway video. Which is still to date one of your most popular videos, right?
Yeah, that one's still every day still gets thousands of views. And I asked a dumb question. Actually, I asked a good question in a dumb way. That's what I did during that interview. So for anybody who hasn't seen this, I was interviewing her for a film called One Day, but the day before were the first photos of her as Catwoman in The Dark Knight Rises. Obviously the Dark Knight series, huge franchise. I'm a massive Christopher Nolan fan. I wanted to find a way to ask her a question about Catwoman that would be interesting, both to me and to other Batman fans. So I didn't really think of how to phrase the question, but I wanted to phrase it as a working out nutrition question, because both you and me, we like that kind of stuff. We find that stuff interesting. And I've asked many other actors and actresses about their workout routines. I didn't really think out the wording of this question quite as good as I could have. And I asked her, how much weight did she lose to get into this shape? Which actually is a fairly, you could ask that question of Christian Bale and he would go, oh, well, yeah, actually I lost 40 pounds to get in this shape. Anne Hathaway was just, had some fun with it. And it became a fun moment where she was feigning that she was insulted. And she went, ah, what a forward young man. How much weight did I lose? And it was a fun moment. It caught me off guard. And I posted this on my YouTube channel, not really thinking anything other than people might have a good laugh at it. And here we are 10 years later and people still ask about it all the time.
Speaking of getting caught off guard during an interview, you got the opportunity to do something which very, very few people will ever get a chance to do. And that's say it doesn't matter to The Rock. Was that a planned moment? Or was that something that you literally just did off the cuff? And what was his genuine reaction to it?
So I went into this interview. This was Fast and Furious 6. And I was like, okay, I definitely want to ask The Rock about CM Punk, who had just entered the UFC. I want to see what his take is on that. And I want to ask The Rock, is there a chance to have a match with Brock Lesnar? And he answered. And this is a 4-minute interview. And I'm like, how could I find a way to have The Rock yell, it doesn't matter at me? And I was setting up this situation. I said, could we set up a scenario where Hobbs would say it doesn't matter? Because Hobbs is so similar to The Rock. His character in Fast and Furious seems very Rock-like. And it's funny, if you watch this video back, The Rock goes, he cocks his head to the side. Yeah, sure. Give me the scenario. And he's just waiting to drop it doesn't matter on me. And I'm like, okay, I got to think of a scenario in my head here. All right, I'm going to be driving down the street. It doesn't matter what the scenario is. And I'm like, this is so great. And what an honor. And then a year later, my friend Kevin McCarthy, who's interviewed The Rock far more times than I have, and he's built up a really good rapport. In fact, The Rock follows my friend Kevin McCarthy on Instagram, which is crazy. And they've exchanged a few DMs. So he goes, do you Kevin's not a huge wrestling fan, but he's like, do you think I could pull and it doesn't matter on The Rock? And I'm like, oh yeah, I think if anyone could do it, it's you. The Rock follows you on Instagram. Of course, if anyone could do it, it's you. So for days, I was showing him all these different It Doesn't Matter videos and It Doesn't Matter compilations. And sure enough, he did it. And I'm like, that is such a cool moment. I recently reshared it on my Instagram and my TikTok, and people just love it because The Rock plays along with it. So my friend Kevin gets The Rock with an It Doesn't Matter. And then The Rock 10 seconds later gets him back. And it was such a cool moment.
Oh, that's absolutely awesome. Going back a little bit to Henry Cavill, this is a big tangent, but I've got to ask this because as I say, it's my passions are pro wrestling and it's a t-shirt. The fitness, health, that kind of thing, but also James Bond. And after that, having a little bit of back and forth with Henry Cavill, Do you think he's going to be the next James Bond?
That's such a great question. That's $1 million question, right? What's really interesting, and I don't want to go off on another tangent, so this would be a tangent on a tangent, but what's really interesting is the only names that are being thrown around for James Bond are British actors. And I get that. But what's interesting is so many iconic Americans have been played by British actors. And what's funny is the idea of an American playing this British icon of 007 is like, how dare you even think about that? Yet Abraham Lincoln, Superman, Martin Luther King were all played recently by Brits. And it's just so funny to me that people can't even wrap their head around the idea that someone other than a Brit might possibly play 007. Let's be honest, it's probably never going to happen. But I find that very interesting. I think that Henry Cavill would be an amazing 007. He's an amazing actor. I think the only problem they might run into is that he's too recognizable as Superman. And this, I mean, that's a pretty great thing to be recognized for. But I think that he might be too recognizable as Superman, that he might not be able to be the face of another franchise. So I would think that, yeah, he would slide into that role perfectly. I just think it's probably not going to be him.
Yeah, I'm in two minds, because generally they pick someone who's relatively unknown, and that's what puts like Richard Madden at the top of my sort of list. I also think that Daniel Craig tipped James Bond into, it was mainstream, but it's even more mainstream than ever before. So they might be more inclined to have a big box office mainstream star, especially someone who's he was genetically built to be James Bond, that man, and he's claimed that he wanted it in interviews. So it was like it could be, I never really thought about the American thing. I think it's something that Brits hold very dear to their culture as James Bond, right? And they just almost don't want it to be ruined. And it's the same thing with having a. Have you seen the new movie?
Yes.
Cool. So I can drop spoiler warnings here.
Yeah, we could spoil it for everybody.
Yeah, exactly. I left that cinema visibly angry because I'm a huge James Bond fan.
I think we went into that movie knowing exactly what was going to happen.
Yeah, I didn't think they were going to kill off James Bond.
Spoiler alert, everybody.
Yeah. I've already done a Bond debate episode where we broke it down, and it was
my friend sent me a meme afterwards, and obviously the film's called No Time to Die, and the meme was no, time to die. And I'm like, so the literally the name of the film is a spoiler.
Yeah, exactly. And but it has opened my eyes to more possibilities with Bond now, because it's like you've booked yourself into a corner so much.
Yeah.
In the sense of like you've killed off the main franchise character, you've lost 60 odd years of history. Like we're in this point now where you can sort of do anything with the role now, and it doesn't bother me in the same way. Like I always looked at having a Bond of color, and I always used to get murky remarks back when I said I'm not keen on the idea. And it's not because I have any issues with someone of color playing a major mainstream role, but it was more like it's supposed, yes, okay, very loosely, but it's supposed to be the narrative of one man. It's like having 4 Harry Potters with Dumbledore's Michael Gambon, and then having Morgan Freeman out the blue for no explanation whatsoever. But now I suppose you could open it up to, Idris may be a bit old now, but they have the guy from Bridgerton's been talked about. The Rock has asked who said he wants it, which would be strange. But,
I think they're going to have to, what was Daniel Craig, 31, 2 when he first took the role?
I think he would have been a bit older now. I think he would be mid to late 30s.
Maybe he was 37. I think it was 37.
Yeah.
I mean, we can look this up. In fact, everybody's like, how did these guys not know? I think Idris made a lot of sense, but the exact reason that he won't play Bond is the exact reason that Daniel Craig is not playing Bond anymore.
Yeah.
And it's just that he's aged out of that character, at least to start fresh now.
Yeah.
But Idris, of all the names that are being talked about, Idris is probably the most talented actor of all those. Look, it's a subjective art. I get that. But Idris's depth of work is unbelievable.
And he's been talked about potentially for a villain role, I hear recently.
Oh,
which
I
I'm
could see that.
totally on board for, especially in like a more realistic sort of setting, non-Marvel cinematic universe sort of thing, like a realistic smart villain. I think
Well, he did it in Fast and Furious.
Hmm.
Yeah. Look, I think the best thing that's happened to the James Bond films over the last decade or so is Mission Impossible. Mission Impossible started taking these fantastical, crazy storylines and cementing them in the real world. Whereas Fast and Furious kind of took these fantastical, crazy storylines and, drove a car into space. Spoiler alert, everybody. So
Yeah.
I think that Tom Cruise and the Mission Impossible franchise has raised the bar so much. Like I was watching No Time to Die and thinking, man, this feels a lot like Mission Impossible.
Yeah, when we were doing the Bond debate, my mate was like, he felt very Mission Impossible when they had the magnets, and that was his biggest worry. Like, oh, they're going to go too far with this, but they didn't. I think it's almost a very good movie. I think if you change the ending some way to not ruin 60 years of history, it's a very good, subjectively good movie. But it's how you leave them. It's like a bad.
What was your favorite Daniel Craig Bond film?
Spectre.
Oh. Skyfall.
Or Skyfall. No, Skyfall.
Skyfall was a legit Oscar film to me.
Yeah, I like, because Spectre gets a bad rap, but I like Skyfall is probably the best standalone movie in the Bond franchise as a whole. But then Spectre is more like a Bond movie. There's a henchman. There's a layer. There's a bit more silly humor. So I think it's a toss up between those two.
Yeah.
Sure. Although Casino Royale is good as well. There's some really good. There's some bad movies in the Craig franchise, but some of the better ones in the whole series, I think.
Yeah. I think that they did a great thing with these movies where with Daniel Craig in the lead role, these movies kind of escaped the campiness that James Bond kind of had a little bit. And again, cemented them in the real world.
Mm. So going back a little bit, you're off this tangent a little bit back to yourself and your career. You mentioned obviously going through how things have changed and the start of YouTube. But what inspired you to get into interviewing people in the first place? It's, as I said, it's a unique and I find fascinating job to be in, of interviewing these great people. But isn't often when people as kids, they grow up going, I want to be the wrestler, I want to be the movie star. What is it that made you want to go into the other side of the interviewing chair?
I wanted to be a TV host. That was the goal. That was the dream for me. And kind of the way to get into that in Canada was by being a news reporter. So long story short, an internship at a really small TV station in Peterborough, Ontario, about an hour away from my hometown, turned into a job, and I was a news reporter. And then it was great. It was amazing. I was on TV 5 days a week and also anchoring the news. I didn't want to be a news reporter at 22 years old. So I started looking into what else can I do? And in Canada, there's not a ton of TV hosting opportunities, but I was auditioning for everything I possibly could. Ended up getting the job on MTV2 Canada and was kind of just thrown into that world of you're a TV host. You're also kind of an entertainment reporter now. You're also kind of like a video game reviewer now. You're also kind of like a concert reviewer. And when you're working under that MTV umbrella, you're doing all of those things. So my second day of work there, I spent the day with the rapper Chingy, the guy who had that song Right There. And it was like, okay, this is what I'm doing. Literally a week before, I was doing some local news story about I don't know, a new stop sign or something. And now I'm spending the day with one of the hottest rappers in 2006 at that time. So I just was fascinated by people and fascinated by hearing their story. And I also learned through that process that the better the questions that you ask, the better the quality of the answers that you'll get. And then the better the quality of the TV segment that you get. And then, it raises the level of the show and everything. And I just started becoming a better listener because of that, because I was genuinely interested. And I would write questions. Sometimes they were had nothing to do with the project that person was promoting, but I was just so curious, always wanted to ask this question of someone like Steven Spielberg or Helen Mirren or something. And it's just I need to ask you. So that was kind of what it was. Just it was curiosity turned up to 11.
I think that's a very similar reason to why I started this. It's I'm that person who's nosy by nature. Like if I walk past a grand building, I see a light on, I want to know what goes on in there. Like what is happening behind closed doors. I like being the fly on the wall. And I'm very similar in terms of prep, which is quite humbling in the sense of, maybe I'm on the right path and I'm just not unprepared. But I'll do my research. I'll have a number of bullet points, very similar to I saw you watch your Las Vegas sort of video, and it's like these are all flip flop, and they already have. But it's just sort of like it gives me a structure to sort of ask particular things, and then it sort of like goes off on whatever direction that it has. So how did it go from being mainly film stars and things like this? How did the wrestling thing come into this? Was it you did the Gregory Iron documentary early on in your career, right? Was that your transition to wrestling, or was there something before that?
It was actually while I was still at MTV too. And we had the option, like we were just interviewing all kinds of celebrities, comedians, actors, directors, musicians. And I saw that WWE was coming to town. So I asked my boss, I said, do you think we could do an interview with a wrestler? My boss is like, yeah, sure. We've done that before. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to get paid to talk to a wrestler. That's really where it began. And it was Bobby Lashley, January of 2007. He was the ECW champion at the time. And he came to our TV station. We did a quick, maybe 10-ish minute interview. We turned it into like a 3-minute TV segment, which I recently reposted on my YouTube channel. And it's just so ridiculous thinking like, I thought that was a good TV segment. And I look back now and I go, that wasn't that great. So that was really it. And every TV station that I went to, it's no secret that I'm a wrestling fan. So I would just kind of make it known that I was a wrestling fan. And I would always kind of watch the event calendar. And if Raw or SmackDown or Impact was coming to town, I would just ask my boss, like, hey, is it cool if we bring in a wrestler? And they would almost always say, yeah, sure. And that was it. And then I started with that idea of having that digital library. I was asking questions I was genuinely interested in. I just started taking the full uncut versions of those interviews and just throwing them on my YouTube channel. And that was really how it began. It just began with me being a wrestling fan, me being excited at the opportunity to talk to some of the biggest stars, and just being able to share that with other people who might be interested in it.
I mean, the biggest stars was physically and, professionally, right? Like, because I remember when I used to work at a Virgin Active in the UK, the WWE had a contract when they did their UK tours with Virgin. So I remember one day, just no one said anything. I walk out the gym, being a PT, being one of the, to a degree, one of the bigger guys in that gym, walking in the next day and like being by far the smallest guy in the gym.
Yeah.
All of a sudden you start benching and you're next to John Cena. I'm like, this is strange.
Yeah.
But my vivid memory was I couldn't pluck up the courage to really speak to anyone at the time. I remember going up to Daniel Bryan because I thought he was the least threatening out of the lot. And I remember being told to crouch down for the photo because he was smaller than me.
No
and I was
way.
like, I still bring up that photo every now and again. It's like, every time there's a Daniel Bryan main event, that will go back on my Instagram, just being recycled.
Yeah.
How was it going into sort of like a land of total giants? Like, as a man who trains and is into that sort of thing, like, is it quite awe-inspiring? Is it quite nerve-wracking meeting these guys, or has it just become second nature to you now?
I think when they're doing the rounds promoting Raw or SmackDown at the local TV stations or radio stations, I think for them, it's a breath of fresh air that you, A, know who they are, and B, are familiar with the product. And I think that goes such a long way instead of, and we've all seen this, we've all seen those generic like morning show TV interviews where they're like, we're here with John Kenna, and SmackDown is going to be at the Quicken Loans Arena tonight. And I think the fact that like I would shake their hand and immediately let them know, like, hey, I'm a big wrestling fan. Like, hey, Hulk Hogan, I was at WrestleMania 18. It's like, oh, like you immediately ingratiate yourself into that world. And I think that they start to welcome you in because of that. So I think for me, it was just, I was a huge wrestling fan. At one point wanted to be a wrestler and trained for a few months at wrestling school. I think that I was speaking their language. It's kind of like, look, you live in Hong Kong right now, and I'm guessing you don't speak a lot of the language, or you probably, maybe you didn't when you got there.
No, it's a difficult language, still not.
Right. But if you started speaking to someone, they would immediately go, oh, oh, like, come on in, like, you get it. And I think that was kind of what it was for me when I would meet all these people.
And like you mentioned being fascinated by people, and before delving into a few specifics in terms of interviews, like, what do you have a favorite interview? Do you have one that sort of like stands out above the rest?
I don't know if I have one specific interview where I could like send you the URL and go, hey, watch this one. But any time I've been able to spend with The Rock has been pretty amazing, both on camera and off camera. And they always say you shouldn't meet your heroes, but if your hero is Dwayne Johnson, you should do whatever you can to meet your hero, because it's an awesome experience. He's kind and he's funny and he's charismatic, but he has this self-awareness about him where he understands he's a huge star and he wants to make this moment memorable for you. So he goes out of his way to grab you on the shoulder or make a comment about what you're wearing, or he does something to make the moment memorable. And it's a lesson I learned without being taught that lesson. It's a lesson I learned just by watching and observing. So any time I've spent with him has been really cool. And he gets it. There's a lot of celebrities that do not enjoy doing interviews or do not enjoy doing press. He understands that it's an important part of who he is and it's an important vehicle for pushing the films that he has. So he gets it, and it makes the moment so much better.
Do you feel you've taken like that ability to make people feel important when you're interviewing them? Like in this instance, physically with like a tap on the shoulder and brings you into it, which I would assume in turn probably rubs off well on the interviewer, because people look at it and go, oh, this guy's got rapport with The Rock. He's obviously taken seriously. Is that something that you feel that you've taken into your interviews and being able to, you mentioned speaking the language, but do you feel it's an important part of getting a good interview is making someone feel comfortable in that environment, making them feel like, you understand them and, you built up good rapport? Like, how important is that part of the
It's
thing?
the most important. And I try to do whatever I can early on to try to build that rapport. And sometimes with celebrity interviews, you've only got 60 seconds on a red carpet, or 90 seconds on a red carpet, or 4 minutes in one of those hotel room junket interviews. So I try to do whatever I can to try to get myself into their world, even if it's just a little bit, because a lot of times they're doing 30, 40, 50 interviews in a day. And there's no way they're going to remember 50 different people. So if you can do something to make yourself stand out, or something to make that interview slightly different than the other ones, that was always what was really important to me. I grew up playing sports, and I think that competitiveness from playing baseball and hockey and being on the high school wrestling team has stuck with me, that I want to just be that much better than the person doing the interview before me.
Yeah. I mean, is there like things that you do that particularly think make you stand out, or is it super unique to the person you have in front of you?
That's a great question. It's so hard to like hold that mirror up to yourself. But I think for me, the interview begins when the Zoom window opens or when you walk in the door. And I think that too many interviewers make the mistake of walking in, shaking their hand, sitting down, looking around, waiting till you get the green light and then going. And it's like, that is not only awkward for everybody, it's unnatural. That's not how things work. So for me, it's the second I walk in, I try to bring some big energy and hope that, the person I'm interviewing can match that. So I think that's been a big thing for me. And also just like knowing who that person is, like being familiar with their filmography or their discography if they're a musician, and just doing the work. Like all of the work, maybe it's only a 4-minute interview, but all the work goes into the days and the weeks and the months leading up to that moment.
Yeah, I totally agree with you when it comes to sort of like bringing energy. That's something very I've taught, whether it's been doing sales training or whether it's working with a client. Like I work in a realm where people often are very intimidated coming into a gym in space, and like making them feel comfortable as quickly as possible, introducing them to people around them, like asking if they come, have they come from far, small talk, build that sort of rapport before you get into the nitty gritty stuff. Like I can imagine being interviewed in the way that you're saying, with the wait, shake the hand, turn on the interview. It's like, this person's here for the interview.
Yeah.
And they're not here to actually get to know me. Some of the best conversations I've had have been like off air where before we started, get chatting, I'm like, I should probably click record now, because the amount of people I've stopped going, this is too good, we need to click record. And I wouldn't have it any other way than that, because it just allows you to, I imagine the same thing with you in interview, when you click that record or when you start the official interview time, you're starting from a level up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm just also genuinely interested. And one of my very good friends, Jake Hamilton, he'll go into interviews and like, he'll ask a question, see that time is running out, get the answer. And as you're standing up, go, hey man, I loved this film or this album or this performance or whatever it happens to be. And then maybe you just get a tiny little bit of insight about that thing. And you go, that was a moment that I just shared with this person. It's not on camera, but it's a moment I shared with them. And I'll just take that and kind of put it in my pocket and know that I had that moment.
So like, what are some of the other interviewing skills that you think are really important to make a good interview? Obviously, you mentioned sort of like building that rapport early on, but what is the things that you think sets a good interview apart from someone that struggles? Because you mentioned
number one is listening. That is the most important thing. And that's just a life skill too. That's just a conversation skill, which so many people do not do. I think that too many people talk and then stop talking just because it's not their turn to talk again. And all they're doing is waiting for their turn to talk again. And if you ask a question, I think you need to be present in that moment and be genuinely interested in what the answer is. And I think that too many people go, okay, they've given their answer. That was question 3. Now I'm on to question 4. And question 4 is like, this isn't a game show. And I think it's really important to make a conversation sound like a conversation. I think that too many people get freaked out by that word interview. Because in your real life, when are you really having an interview in quotations? Off the top of my head, the only interviews I can think of are a job interview, or maybe the police are interviewing you. Like you would never say like, hey man, you want to go grab a beer tonight so I can interview you? You would never do that. Yeah. You would grab a beer tonight so we can chat. And I wouldn't be like, okay, so I'm going to ask this. And then Simon's going to say this. And when Simon's done with that, I'm going to ask this thing. And then no, you just kind of flow with the conversation. So the number one skill for anybody is listen.
I say I couldn't agree more with that. I think the only downside I've ever had with that sometimes when I get into a really good conversation, a really good answer, is sometimes I get so into the answer I almost lose my trail of thought. So it's like, okay, can I bring myself back to the room? Do you still find that? Do you find yourself getting caught up sometimes in interviews where it's just like you'd almost just go into sort of like listening mode, and then you're just like, I've got to keep this flowing?
Yeah. And like, how far down the tangent can you go? Yeah. You're talking to somebody who's known for, thing A over here, and you start talking about thing K, and you're just like, well, this is so interesting. Like, tell me more about this. Like, and then you kind of have to catch yourself and go, okay, let's get back on track here. But yeah, like that, what's interesting about interviews are people are innately interesting. And everybody's favorite topic is themselves. So if you can ask a lot of questions about that person, I mean, a lot of people just love speaking about that. So I think I learned 2 very specific things from spending so many years in the news industry. And one goes back to what you were saying earlier about like needing to book guests for every show, is I put deadlines on myself now. And that's when you work in the news industry, your deadline is 6 p.m. that night. And if it's not ready to go, like you're in big trouble. And I think the other thing is when I go into an interview and it's 4 minutes and we're supposed to talk about, the latest James Bond film, and you're going way off track, you've got to go, okay, all right, let's bring this train back on the tracks here and address the thing that we're talking about. So I think that the background I've had in that has been very helpful. But this is the great thing about podcasts. This is one of the best things about podcasts is the conversations are not watered down to just a soundbite here and a soundbite there. It's one of the reasons I love listening to Joe Rogan. He'll bring someone on and not even really talk about what their profession is. Just chat. And it's so cool. It's kind of like we're eavesdropping in on a conversation between 2 people who are at the top of their game, whatever that game happens to be. And I love that this is where it's starting to go with podcasts.
I agree. I think I've been into podcasts for so long, and in part of that was that ability of like getting like understanding someone's psyche. There are people that I've listened to so much that I almost feel like I know them because I've listened to them so regularly. And I've never met them before in my life. You know, there's a point in time where I know, you know, I know so much about the Wrestle Talk guys, and I've never met them. Because I used to listen to whenever I was going through a stressful period. I used to, okay, I'm gonna stick in the wrestling pocket. I'm gonna no more health and fitness stuff for a while. And I every day on like clockwork. And I think that's it's a realm where you can't really do that in any other medium. It's sort of like truly get a peek behind the curtain, because it sort of can go off in any direction. Do you find like building this as your business rather than a hobby? Do you find there's sort of a balance you need to make between what you find interesting, and obviously you've built a niche around a little bit around wrestling and movies and things you like, but do you ever get caught up going, okay, I find this interesting, but I'm going very much away from where my audience think, or do you think they're so aligned that you just let a conversation go where it needs to, if you're not?
It's interesting how I think the podcast audience is very different from the YouTube audience, is very different from the TikTok audience, and so on and so on. I will talk to basically anybody that I find interesting on my podcast, because I find it interesting. And if you want to listen, great. If you don't want to listen, that's okay. Wait till the next episode. I feel like YouTube, the numbers, you know, if you put something on YouTube that people don't like or your subscribers aren't clicking on, it just won't get shown to as many people. So there'll be often times when I have a podcast that I find fascinating on the audio version, and I'm like, you know what? I just know that won't perform on YouTube. So this will just be a podcast exclusive. But to answer your question, I don't really worry. If it's interesting to me, I know it's going to be interesting to at least one other person, or at least I would hope so. So, and selfishly, this is the cool thing about podcasting is you could never say to, I'm trying to think of like an interview I did recently. You could never say to a former FBI negotiator, like, hey, do you have an hour next week so I can just talk to you? They would be like, what are you? Of course not. No, I don't have time for that. But if you bring the value of, hey, I've got this podcast and this audience, could I talk to you for an hour and promote whatever it is you want to promote? Of course, then you'll get a yes. And that's the really cool thing here, is leading with value, which is a great thing to do in any aspect of your life. Lead with value and you can get some great results.
Yeah. I always find it's like super interesting, certainly in the early part of my career before podcasts were really a thing, you know, trying to get in front of anyone. And this is, you know, I've paid a lot of people the time. This is not necessarily me being cheap, but it's you going, hey, can I book an hour of your time? And they're like, okay, my consult fee is this. If you just go, hey, I've got a podcast, would you like to be on the podcast? It's amazing how many more doors will open. But you bring me on quite nicely there to talking about almost networking skills. Because obviously, like you said, you've mentioned a lot that you've got your foot in the door by working with some of these people and built a network through TV. Yeah. But to keep this going, keep this YouTube channel going since 2011, there must have been skills that you've learned, you feel, has allowed you to get into certain markets or even expand your eyes to get different people on. I watched in the Vegas episode, you had from Jay Cutler to Carrot Top to RVD. That shows the breadth of the, you know, variety of people you speak to. What are the networking tips you've learned? How have you got yourself into these circles? And what advice should you give to someone who's maybe looking to get themselves into various circles?
I think one of the biggest things is lead with value. Like, what's in it for them? Their time is very important. Not that yours isn't, but their time is super important. So what's in it for them? And I think that too many people lead with what's in it for you. Like, hey, come be on my podcast. And then the sentence just kind of ends right there. Like, that's the request. Like, could you be a guest on my show? It's called this. I think it's important to bring the value and show them like, this is, you know, this is valuable for you. You know, it helped me that I had some really big names early on in my career. So I think that when someone looks at my YouTube channel or looks at my list of interviews and goes, oh, he's talked to these people. Yeah, sure. I could do an interview as well. You also start to learn that whatever industry that you're in, whether it's bodybuilding or wrestling or movies or music, whatever, they're all really small and very tight knit. And you start to realize that the person you really, really want to interview is probably only one or two connections away from somebody you already know or somebody you've talked to. So it's a matter of building trust, bringing value, and then figuring out like, oh, does this person know that person? If so, how can I bring enough value with this person to hopefully one day get an interview with that person?
Yeah, okay, yeah. And it's almost like that domino effect when you start to sort of get into those circles.
Yeah, like I just recently, like you said, interviewed Jay Cutler. I would hope maybe one day that because I interviewed Jay Cutler, that could lead to an interview with, I don't know, Dorian Yates or Ronnie Coleman or somebody else within that world. So I think that kind of one domino starts to hit another domino, and then you go, oh, wow, I know a lot of people in this space.
Yeah, and it's an amazing thing. I was quite humble when I actually started looking at what my network was, very much in the fitness industry. And I have a few close-ish connections to Dorian Yates, so I'll see if I can make that happen.
Great.
Yeah, but like it's amazing, like how many people I say are willing to help out. It's been super humbling for me. Like purely on a selfish thing, you mentioned leading with value and giving value, and as you said, a lot of people come and say, just be on my podcast.
Yeah.
What? Because you must get plenty of podcast requests. What made you stand out? I'd never met you before this call. What made you stand out about my request that made you go, yeah, why not?
I think that what the work that you do is pretty great. So congrats to you on what you've done and what you've built here. I also didn't want to just talk about wrestling, and I appreciate that was part of it, that we weren't just going to talk about wrestling, but I'm happy to talk to anybody. I'm happy to do an interview with anybody if I have the time. Also, I appreciate you giving us like a ton of lead time. And I think that there's been a lot of times when I've got a request, it's a Tuesday, and someone says like, hey, are you free on Thursday? Like, generally speaking, probably not.
Yeah. As I said, for me, this is such a big passion project. I'll work around people. My job is semi-flexible. Going into like some of the interesting interviews, like, to close off, because I know you've got something, very shortly. One of the ones I wanted to speak about was the David Benoit interview, giving David Benoit a voice. In some ways, that was extremely brave and extremely powerful interview, because this is giving a voice to a man whose family have been silenced for a decade, even though through no fault necessarily of his own. How did that interview come about, and what do you think the impact of that was for yourself and maybe for him?
That interview came about in the most random way. He sent me a message on Instagram and said, I love listening to your interviews. And I went, oh, cool. Thanks. We followed each other on Instagram. And he said, if you ever want to have me on, I'd love to be a guest. And I went, oh, wow. Like, yeah, for sure. Let's make that happen. I'll fly to you in Edmonton and we'll make it happen. He's like, well, I'm going to be in Las Vegas at some point in the next few months. I'll let you know when I'm there. And we just kept in touch, and we still keep in touch. And he was like, all right, I'm going to be in Las Vegas on these dates in January. And I went, done. I will fly myself there. We will make this happen. What you don't see on camera is everything that happened before the interview. I flew in that. So we were doing the interview, I believe, on a Thursday morning in Las Vegas. I flew in that Wednesday night. My flight got in at like 6 p.m. We weren't doing the interview till 10 a.m. the next morning. As I'm landing, I shot him a message and said, hey, if you don't have any plans tonight, do you want to grab a drink? And he said, sure. Because yeah, me and my buddy are just finishing up dinner. Like, well, let's go grab a drink. So we ended up spending the night walking around the Las Vegas Strip, just drinking those giant drinks that you drink when you're in Las Vegas, those yard drinks. And that broke the ice so much, rather than just me knocking on his hotel room door. Hey, I'm here for the interview to talk about, the craziness in your family. The fact that we were able to spend all that time really broke the ice. And there was one point that night when he looked at me and he goes, hey, I just want you to know, bro, nothing's off limits. And I went, nothing? He goes, no, I trust you and talk about whatever you want. I went, okay. And that was what made the interview so much more comfortable than it could have been.
Yeah, because you mentioned earlier on, like, what is the thing that is interesting when you go into an interview? What's the thing that you want to get out of this? And I can imagine going into an interview like that. I mean, obviously, it's not necessarily a very nice topic, but it's one of those things. It's the elephant in the room, and knowing that that's okay must have eased your nerves, I presume, tremendously.
Yeah, I mean, the interview was like 30-ish minutes. It had to come up at some point in time. It had to come up. And boy, there were a lot of things in that interview I don't think he had ever spoken about. Certainly not publicly. He really hadn't done a lot of interviews, but I think that it was like therapeutic for him. I think that you could physically see a weight lifting off of his chest between the start of the interview and the end of the interview.
Yeah, I felt that. I felt that watching. I thought that was incredibly powerful and very brave on his part, but also brave on your part, because it's something that there's so much. I don't want to use the word hatred, but like there's so much animosity, and some part justified to what happened with Chris, that it could have been something where that, even though it's got nothing to do with David or yourself, it could have rubbed off that wrong way. It could have gone so many different ways, and I think that's a very important interview, I think, to do. And it's certainly one of my favorites that you've done for that exact reason.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think it's really important, to know that the sins of the father are not the sins of the son. And that's his last name. His last name will be Benoit for the rest of his life. And that's something that he's going to have to live with. But maybe he can start to change the narrative of what it means to be a Benoit. And
he's also very proud of it, which I loved in the interview, that he was still proud of his heritage. And it's like he's managed to do all this to see his father in what he did for him. Like one of the things I find so interesting about people, that people aren't innately good or bad. People are always shades of grey. And while we focus on the thing that happened at the end of his life, there's so many things that someone could be a monster to one person, but be a hero to somebody else. And that's why I'm fascinated by the show like You with on Netflix now with Penn Badgley, and like how in that first series he was like a hero to that child next door, but we saw the rest of it. And humans are very much like that. I mean, no one, there's more to somebody than the thing that defines them. And I think that was an important interview.
Yeah, it's not just black or white. And say what you want about Chris Benoit, but other than that last weekend of his life, it seemed like he was a pretty good guy and a great father. And, who knows? We'll never know what happened in that last weekend of his life, but it's too bad that his legacy in the ring, and let's be honest, he was one of the very best to ever step foot into a ring. It's too bad that his legacy will always forever be tainted because of that.
So to close off, I've got 4 closing questions for you that are going to be relatively quick fire. The first one is, do you have a wrestling moment in your eyes that stands out more than anything, that just sits in the front of your mind going, that was one of the best moments of all time?
Absolutely. WrestleMania 18, Skydome, Toronto, Rock versus Hogan. I was there. I have the poster. This is my ticket in the bottom corner here. Hulk Hogan signed this as well. So I was there, fully went into that match expecting to cheer for The Rock. He loved The Rock. And then as soon as the match started, I found myself cheering for Hogan like everybody else. And the first time I interviewed The Rock, I told him, I said, I was there. Rock Hogan, my favorite match of all time. He goes, "Oh yeah? Who are you cheering for?" So I was cheering for Hogan. He goes, "Me too."
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, there was like the 2 moments that out. One is going to I've not been to too many wrestling events, being from the UK, and now nothing happens in Hong Kong. But the going to see at the Royal Albert Hall, the NXT event where Mustache Mountain beat the Undisputed Era was a moment. I remember sort of the guy I was with, we got all right seats, and they were like, there's a space in the front row. Let's just act confident and just go. And then all of a sudden, no one questioned, just bang, straight in the front row. Shaking hands with Aleister Black and things like that. I was like,
yeah,
awesome. And the other one was the reason I got this t-shirt. I have never heard a pop, a sustained pop like that second episode of Rampage. I just think that's unbelievable.
Yeah, that was a pretty special moment.
So going on to the next thing. So I've said this in my DMs beforehand. Secrets to the Fountain of Youth. How do you not age? You're it's more than Paul Rudd.
That's very kind. Just great lighting. Great lighting helps a lot. I think it's not unlike your secret. Health is wealth. Health is such an important thing. And Robin Sharma has this great quote. I hope I'm doing it justice, but it's, health is the crown that the well man wears that only the sick man can see. And it's basically saying you don't understand how good you've got it till it's gone. And that's why I spend a lot of time in the gym, or a lot of time just being active and hiking or walking. I think that's just a big thing. Health is wealth. And, you've probably seen on my YouTube channel that I promote a skincare line called Tiege Hanley. And the reason I promote it is because it seriously works. And if you are a man and your age begins with a 3 and you're not doing any sort of moisturizing on your face,
I'm that man.
like you are going to like the future version of yourself is going to be so mad at you for not taking care of yourself earlier on.
Okay, I'll very much bear that in mind. And it's if you ever get any time want to do a round 2, I'd love to chat health, fitness, skincare.
Sure, yeah, I'd love to.
So last couple of questions. One, what was it like getting a chop from Sean Spears?
Well, at that point in the day, I had already taken 18 chops. So one more was, just heaping like, a few more stacks of hay onto the big pile, a few more scoops of dog poop onto the big pile, but look, there's a reason that Sean Spears and Tyler Breeze are in the position that they're in. Like they're so good at everything that they do in the ring. That moment was cool, man. I will say the way that we made it look in the video was that it was their idea to give me a bunch of chops. It was fully my idea to take 20 chops. I brought it all on myself. When I got there, I said to Sean Spears, I said, let's make it a segment where I'm in the ring, like promoting your wrestling school. And, I can take a bump. I can run the ropes. And he goes, yeah, well, how about after you're done all that? How about I give you a chop? And I'm like, it's fine with me. Sure, I'll take a chop, but let's make it more interesting. Like, why don't we line up all your students and have them chop me? And he's like, oh, okay. So yeah, that's how that whole thing came together. You saw my chest all red and welted. It took about 6 days for the swelling to go down, and my chest went from purple to red to pink to then just bruised, like that yellowy brown, and then fine. I have a permanent handprint in my chest now, but that's neither here nor there.
The closest thing I remember is that I've done horrible 10 plus exercise quad leg sessions where I've had bruises on my legs from them and couldn't walk for 7 or 8 days. And I can't imagine that for the 18 odd days of recovery. So final question I have, because I know you've got something coming up, and it's turning your own questions back on you. What are 3 things that you are grateful for?
Ooh, love this. I practice gratitude every single day. I start with it and I end with it. So for me, it's health. Going back to what we were just saying, like how fortunate are we to be healthy, especially in a time like this? Number 2, my family. And that extends out to all my friends, my girlfriend, everybody that I love in my life. But my parents just celebrated their 47th wedding anniversary, which I mentioned in that vlog that I did at the studio tour in Las Vegas. And man, 47 years, especially in this time, is crazy. And they've given such an amazing example of partnership and companionship and love that I hope to one day aspire to. But man, what they've done is amazing. And they're still best friends. And I'm just so grateful for opportunities. Like we are on the other side of the planet from each other. It is a different day for both of us. And we're sitting here and talking in real time. And I'm so incredibly grateful for that. And also grateful that if the pandemic were to ever happen in our timeline of life, this is, for better or for worse, the best time that it could have happened. Like if this happened in the 90s, what would happen? Like we wouldn't be able to be connected to people other than long distance phone calls.
It's a weird thing. And again, this is another talk for another day, but in one way, we might not have had this lockdown because the media has made this bigger than it ever would have been in the 90s. But I agree. Yeah. I think I've connected with more people via Instagram during the pandemic that I probably wouldn't have thought, because I would have gone, well, I'm just going to message my mate who's down the road. But now, because everyone is speaking virtually, it opens the doors to so many more interesting people.
Yeah, it's normalized Zoom calls too. Like I didn't have Zoom before March of last year. And now I've done, 100 interviews over Zoom over the last year.
Exactly. And I suppose it opens, that network even expands because you don't have to be reliant on, when can you get a flight over? When can you land? It's like, can you do tomorrow? Well, maybe in your case, give a bit more time.
Yeah, maybe.
So where can people find you, whether it's through your YouTube channel, whether it's Instagram, whether it's the skincare line? Tell us a little bit about the stuff that you do.
So on social media, it's at Chris Van Vliet, wherever you're, on social media. My YouTube channel is also my name. My podcast is Insight with Chris Van Vliet. So wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find my podcast. Insight with Chris Van Vliet. And man, again, thank you for making the time. Thank you for waking up early and working with the time zone thing. And yeah, I just really appreciate you and appreciate the great questions that you brought here today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. It's been really, really, really good fun. And I always take I have a sign of a good podcast episode where I could do this for another hour and a half. And that's definitely tick that box. So thank you. Thank you very much.
No, appreciate you.